Welcome to the Real College Life Podcast. This is a podcast designed for college students, with college students, and sometimes crew staff, coming to you live from the beautiful town of Stevens Point, Wisconsin, the city of Stevens Point, Wisconsin. It's a city. We're over town size. We're bigger than that.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Ryan Nadel, and I have two amazing people with me today. Seth Smith, graduate of UWSP, intern with crew, amazing person. And Kyle Wilterdink, currently a junior at UWSP.
Indeed.
Studying business,
organizational leadership.
Organizational leadership.
And sociology.
And sociology.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Love it. We got an awesome episode today because we are talking about Seth's recent talk at Crew on the issue of politics. And Seth, you just did a great job. You hit it out of the park.
Thank you.
I loved the talk.
I thought it was good.
It was really good.
I thought it was really it's captivating, like the attention grabbing. Like I felt like I was very focused. It was good.
And obviously we're in the most important presidential election of our lifetime. They always say that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to quantify that.
Yeah.
But
do you say that it's the most important one? I feel like is a bit of an overstatement.
Potentially. Yeah.
It really depends on your perspective, because, I mean, like, if you value certain political issues over others, then, yeah, maybe this one is the most important.
Right.
But also, if you value different political issues, maybe you're going to value, like, the 1964 election more.
Right.
What happened
Or 1864.
in the 1864 election?
Well, 1864 was...
We weren't alive then, though, so it wouldn't have been of our lifetime, right?
That is
so we can't, if we're qualifying it by that,
It probably
qualify.
affected
Sorry,
us in
I
some
have a
way.
history degree, so kind of I always bleed back into the past.
Right. But 1864 was a big one.
Yeah, well, I feel like 1860 was more significant because that's when Lincoln got elected.
That's true.
Maybe. We don't know the significance until, like, that person's in office and see what happened, right?
And then also after they're out of office.
Right.
Sometimes you don't even see the effects until like 20 years later.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I'll kick us off with a question about our current political climate for you guys. Do you think the average 20-year-old is cynical about American politics? Or 18-year-old, or, 22-year-old, or however you want to. Your demographic of person.
I feel like there's a lot of cynicism in general in American politics right now. Like, I think trust in politicians is probably approaching an all-time low. At the very least, within the last, 50 years, I think we're reaching an all-time low, and that's even with, Clinton and Nixon and their scandals included. Right. People just don't trust the government right now. I think that a lot of people have good reason not to trust the government on some issues, but I think in general, a lot of people don't trust politicians to get things done when they say they're going to get done. I just don't know if, 18 to 24-year-olds are, the most cynical.
Yeah. I don't think I don't get the sense from my vantage point that they're more cynical. But I was curious, have you guys talked to your peers? What do you think, Kyle?
I think it's more so the confusion and the tension of how much division there is. Maybe.
Okay.
I don't know how to word that best, but I just think there's a lot of there's completely polar opposites, and it feels like you have to be on one side or the other and fully support one side or the other. And if you land somewhere in between, or just somewhere not exactly on those, those poles on the spectrum, if you're somewhere in between there, whether it's dead center or leaning one way or the other, then it just feels like there's a lot to wrestle with. And I think that's where it's just now I just not even gonna think about it, or now I have to convince myself to believe this, or I have to because I believe this means I also have to believe this. And I think in a way we're kind of told by culture that oh, you believe this about this, that means you're this, and just totally generalizing everything. And so then it's okay, I guess. So some people fall into that category, or then you get into the tension or the disagreements and arguments on why, okay, just because I believe this doesn't mean I have to agree with that as well.
Do you, because you guys have only been voters for a few years.
I've never voted. Well, I guess
you've never voted in.
I've voted locally,
a presidential election,
right?
I have.
You have.
Yeah, I turned 18 6 months before the last election, but yeah.
Tipping point. Are you excited to vote, Kyle? I mean, in the sense of like, woo, I'm an American, I get to vote, or is this more like I'm doing my duty kind of thing?
Probably more I'm doing my duty.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because I don't know where I sit currently on where we're at in, our political candidates. I don't know. I feel like I'm not excited for either of my options or opportunities.
Sure.
And or just like not maybe super thrilled about what it means that I am contributing towards, even though I believe it is, the responsible thing to do. And but I don't know that I'm like excited to have to do that.
Yeah.
To be fair.
It sounds like you're almost more excited for the policy that you're supporting and less excited about the actual politicians that you're supporting.
Maybe.
There's some amount of.
I think what's hard is
there.
like the policy I'm supporting for one person, like means I'm also supporting a policy that I maybe disagree with.
Mm-hmm. Like no matter which side you choose, like there's going to be something you disagree with.
Right.
So trying to put your full support behind that person can feel a little bit odd.
For sure.
Yeah. Interesting. That's good.
Yeah.
All right, your turn. What question are you noodling on?
Boy. Yeah, I think part of Seth's talk, like you talked about how we can't escape a political world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think kind of what I was talking about off of Ryan's questions, like, why can't we? Like, especially as Christians with the Christian worldview, why is it impossible for us to escape a political worldview instead of just like trying to, or a political world overall, instead of, it's just like, well, maybe that's something in my life that I can forget about and just like try and become more like Jesus. And it doesn't really matter what I do or how I vote or how I, apply that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like when I brought this up in my talk, I focused a lot on the passage of scripture where the Pharisees and the Herodians come up to Jesus and ask him if it's legal to pay a poll tax, like a tax that somebody would pay so that way they can vote. Especially in the Roman Empire, they're not going to be voting on a ton of things because it's not really a democracy, it's an empire. But there's still this question of, is it legal to do this? Especially because there are a lot of Jewish people in that day who were not very happy with the Roman rule. So they kind of thought that when Jesus answered this question, he would either say, pay the poll tax and anger the Jewish people and the Pharisees, or say, don't pay the poll tax and anger the Herodians, and then he'd probably get arrested for treason or being a traitor or something. So what I took away from that passage, especially because Jesus finishes his explanation and his answer of this question, because he kind of takes, not necessarily a middle ground, but he takes a third position that the Herodians and the Pharisees didn't really expect, but he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. Because he points out, like, whose face is on the coin that you're going to use to pay the poll tax? Caesar's face is on the coin, so the coin belongs to the government, comes from the government. So he says, okay, if that's Caesar's, then give it to Caesar, and give to God what is God's. And to me, that kind of established a dichotomy of Christians should give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to the world, give to the government things that belong to the government, and then also give to God the things that are God's. We have these two different duties, one to the world and one to God. And especially in the broader context of other things that Jesus in the Bible teaches, we need to put that duty to God above everything, because God is like the center of our life. He is the thing that is the reason why we're able to be here. Like,
and we're made in his image, right? So,
we're made in his image, exactly. So like we are, I mean, the word Christian in general means little Christ. Like we're supposed to act like Christ in all things that we do. Christ valued his relationship with the Father more than anything else. So we should value that relationship and that duty that we have to serve God higher than everything else. But then we still have that duty to the world, and everything that we do to serve the world is kind of filtered through that lens of our duty to God. So if Jesus is even telling us to engage with the world and to like pay our taxes kind of a thing, like using the specific example from that, if Jesus is telling us to do that, then it's a good thing that we should do that. So one of the things that I kind of talked about and was thinking through was, we can't escape a political world because everything around us is determined by politics. Like the energy that you get, the water that you get, that's determined by political factors.
Yeah. I mean, it's like myself and so many other people have gone to like Guatemala on a missions trip. And you look at Guatemala and you're like, why don't you have running water? And there's, as much as you want to like break down the different dynamics of why it's hard to have running water, you transplanted Guatemala into Nebraska, you know, they'd figure out a way to have running water and you know, and clean water. It's a political dynamic that keeps that from happening.
Mm-hmm.
In, you know, the Proverbs talks about how the fields of the poor would bear much fruit, but they're swept away through injustice. And I mean, to your point, I think it was a brilliant point. I mean, I think we aren't going to escape a political process, and that doesn't mean we get to pound the table and say I have it my way all the time. We have to engage in this concept of voting and articulating our thoughts to one another and pressing in and pushing back and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But good and evil come out of the political dynamic, and we're never going to your point, Seth, again, we're never going to escape that reality. Mm-hmm. And is it complicated? Absolutely. Should we, you know, I tell this story a lot because I think as a young person, as a late teens, early 20s, like I think the vision of my life was simplicity. I just wanted simplicity. I didn't want complexity. And the older I get, the more I read the Proverbs, and you guys probably know this, that I read a proverb pretty much every day for the day of the month, whatever. And what I find with that is that the simple in Proverbs is usually equated with the foolish.
Mm-hmm.
And man, that's frustrating because I just want to be simple. I just want a simple life. I mean, we hear this stuff. It's kind of it's a country song, or maybe 100 country songs.
Definitely 100.
You know, Johnny Denver, right? Thank God I'm a country boy. Simple kind of living, never did me no harm. You know, that was my like mantra, right? That's what I want. And yet we don't live in a simple world. We live in a very complicated world. And the sooner I think, you know, a 20-year-old person can just put their arms around that and just go, that's real life. You know, God is complicated. Theology is complicated. Politics are complicated. That's the way life is. And I think the sooner we embrace that as people, the further we can get in having robust discussions. Because, you know, as a history major, Seth, I mean, the framers of our Constitution, you can say what you want about their theology, but they weren't simple people.
Yeah.
You can say what you want about their hypocrisy, but they weren't simple people. They were, you know, the Federalist Papers, I read that in political science, and I'm sure you have it memorized, but...
like 86 of them, I can't memorize them all.
Well played. You know, these are complicated ideas. I mean, these are deriving off of philosophers and different perspectives of what it means to be human that created what is the United States of America. And we need to have a deep appreciation and even probably a respect for the complexity that exists in our own. I mean, you know, there's so many different, like, you know, the Electoral College, like what a complicated idea. All of this stuff. So I think there is that complexity that's hard to embrace, but is super essential for us. So.
Yeah, and I like that you bring it kind of back to the Constitution and like the founding of our country, because our country was founded by people who disagreed on things fundamentally. Like, there's a reason why after Washington left office, there was just the immediate factions split into two different political parties.
Yeah.
But the Constitution was founded on compromise as well. These people were able to have a dialogue and to make a compromise on things that like weren't moral or ethical issues all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, some of them were, but like most of the time they were just arguing about how to run the country and like the different things that they could do to appease one side, appease the other, and to make both sides happy, and then move forward beyond that. They're able to have that discussion and have that kind of dialogue. Like,
which I almost felt like during the vice presidential debate that happened this week, I almost felt like we were kind of getting back, at least in that debate, to a flavor of that. I was watching it with my son, with Aiden, you know, 9 years old, and he articulated a thought that I think I was feeling as I watched the debate. He said, "I really like watching this, Dad." And I think it was partly because the level and tone of the conversation was not so insidious, and the tension didn't feel so high that it was kind of like, you know, watching a cage match. It felt much more like watching a political discourse.
Yeah.
And I think that in some strange way, there was almost kind of a sense of hope in that, like to what you're saying. I think about it like when you really don't want to engage with somebody, you usually won't even fight with them. you'll just try to get as far away from that person as possible.
Yeah, the strategy is avoidance.
Yeah, but if you actually put the energy into fighting with someone, in a way that's obviously, you know, verbal, to actually like articulate a thought and to listen to a thought coming back to you, there's actually still some hope of relationship in that context.
Mm-hmm.
And I do feel like we've gotten to a point of like, I don't even want to be in the same room with you politically, but that for whatever reason, that debate kind of felt like, okay, maybe we should really try to work on this together and try to get our points across and listen to each other, which I think is something that should be, as Christians, something we are willing to do and engage with. And
yeah,
I think
to your point, they were respectful, and they even admitted points where they agreed on things. Now they might fully disagree on the ways to go about like solving those problems, but they both were able to agree like there are problems, or this strategy didn't work that somebody tried. And I think that that's a very, very big thing to do. Like, it shows a lot of thought and care has gone into their opinions, because even them trying to appear the best and the strongest to the American people was able to admit, we can still agree on this.
Yeah,
thing.
and
I think that was really, really cool.
And we're sometimes inconsistent, and we sometimes fail at things, and we're human in all of that. So,
for sure, that's good. Yeah, so that was truth one in your talk, is we cannot escape a political world, and then I believe truth two, you said something along the lines of having to live under the lordship.
Yeah, we cannot escape a
Christ.
political world, but we must live under the lordship of Christ.
Yeah, so what does it look like, just in general, to live under the lordship of Christ, politically involved or not?
Wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to me, living under the lordship of Christ is looking to Christ's example and trying to live a life that models his. And that sounds very simple, but it's in actuality a little bit more complicated than that. Like, living under the lordship of Christ, we talk in crew a lot about like who is on the throne of your life. Like, are you on the throne of your life, or is God on the throne of your life, or is Christ on the throne of your life? And to me, that means doing a very similar process to what I did to create the talk. I prayed about it. I tried to make sure that I was being guided by the Holy Spirit to figure out what to say, how to think about this, and like what is the best way to handle certain issues. And I would look to Jesus. I mean, we're probably going to get to this at some point, but the entire like back half of my talk was looking to the example of Christ and how he related to people and how he interacted with people and how he directed conversations, and trying to model that, trying to take principles out of that. Like, Jesus operated with kindness towards basically everybody that he interacted with. He operated with a kind of quiet confidence that wasn't like smug and overconfident, but he knew exactly what was true about him and the people around him. Yeah. And then he worked within that without coming off as like a haughty jerk, because he was able to acknowledge his place and acknowledge the people around him place, and then still be able to work within that in the context of a relationship.
Yeah. And I think part of the struggle of lordship in this moment is that word kindness. In that, you know, when you study the New Testament and you look at the epistles, the word kindness is just repeated over and over again. And again, I don't have the Greek sitting in front of me right now. But essentially, when I think of the word kindness, I do think that there has to be some level of experiential goodness coming out of a gesture, an emotion, of a situation, of a comment. And I think we've tried to water down kindness to this place of like, well, I can be a jerk and I'm still kind. You know, I can say really like out there things about people on the other side of whatever, but I'm still being kind. And I guess I've been wrestling just in my own countenance, in my own emotional world, in the places where I'm feeling emotionally charged right now. I have felt this new movement toward saying, Lord, I want to respond out of kindness. And again, I'm not going to be perfect at that like Jesus was, but I think part of the lordship issue was taking my emotions, my natural tendencies, the things that I want today, tomorrow, the next day, and surrendering those things. Not that I don't try to achieve and accomplish things, but that achievement is brought under God's authority, which I believe it always is. I mean, lordship is a goofy thing because He's the king of the whole world. He's the king of the whole universe. What do I have to give back to him? And yet I think as humans, we do have this stewardship, this capacity to actually surrender up our life and say, God, you can do what you want with it. I'm not going to, and as I'm talking to students about it too, like we brought it up this week when we were talking to people about the gospel on campus, and this person's like, I don't want to like quote a country song here, but it's like Jesus take the wheel. And I'm like, it's just it just works, Lordship is Jesus take the wheel. It just works. I'm not going to, anyways, you have a take, Kyle?
I don't know if I have a take, but I have a question. As a first-time voter,
okay,
how do I, in this very, like, divided and contentious political season that we're in, how do I, enact my responsibility as a citizen to vote and to think about politics? And how do I, and especially social media, on campus, in our classrooms, whether it's by a professor or a classmate that we're sitting by, like, this is being talked about. How do I, it's kind of a multi-question here, like, go into those conversations being passionate about my viewpoint, but also showing kindness and love and respect to that person. And then also, how do I just continue to live under the lordship of Christ as things become more divided? And how do I allow that to help me make my decision come voting day? There's a lot there. I'm sorry.
There's a lot there. I think
that is you have that's another whole podcast.
Yeah. My initial thought, though, was as somebody who's voting for the first time, you might not have fully formed political opinions. You might know which way that you lean on certain issues, but knowing the actual rationale behind those beliefs, I think, is very important. And I think that as Christians trying to live under the lordship of Christ, we kind of have three main things that we look for when we make decisions. And it's the word and teaching of God, and then our own faculties of logic and reasoning, and then our emotions. Our emotions typically should remain at the bottom of that. Our emotions can be incredibly powerful, and they want to be dominant when we're making these decisions, especially big, important decisions, especially things that can be as personal as politics. But at the end of the day, our emotions should be at the bottom because they're the least reliable thing that we have. Our own logic and reasoning is also good because if we can reason through something, then that means that we are usually able to articulate why we believe that. But at the end of the day, the source is still us for, well, I think this take is best because I think X, Y, and Z. But a better thing to be able to say is, I think this because the Bible says this, and I agree with that. So when it comes to trying to form a political opinion, the Bible is not a pamphlet for how to answer political things. It doesn't say, hey, you should vote Republican or Democrat or a third party. It doesn't say that. Those words don't appear in our Bible because the modern political scheme wasn't a thing when the Bible was written. We need to acknowledge that the Bible was written in a time that was 2,000 years ago. It was written in a specific time and place. That doesn't diminish its value as scripture, but that does mean that we can't always read our modern political situation into that. But it does give us a lot of principles to work with. It tells us ways that Jesus approaches issues. It tells us ways that we should approach the concept of humanity and the different things that humans do. It tells us how we should act towards other people. It tells us ways that we should guide our lives. It doesn't say hey, if you like this, then that means you should go into this career, just like you can't look to the Bible for what you want your career to be. But it does give us advice and suggestions and godly ways to direct our living. And that should then bleed into our ability to think about political issues.
Yeah, and I just think it's good to put your own vote in perspective. No presidential election has been decided by one vote. And how many people's minds, the three of us, if we just said from now until election day, we're going to try to change everyone to vote like us, how many people could we actually change?
Across the three of us?
Yeah.
Maybe one.
I know, you know what I mean? How hard is it? How hard is it to actually change a person's position? And I hear conservative radio people sometimes talk about I changed this person from a liberal into a conservative, and I don't doubt it happens, but it probably happened over a 6-month or a year or 2-year process of people thinking about issues differently. A lot of times probably having different family or relationship things that affected how they were viewing things. And so even when we think about our passions, being sober enough to say, like, I want to care about issues deeply, but I also have to admit that, like, my ability to walk into a room and change everyone's perspective on an issue to align with me is not realistic. And that helps me monitor, kind of measure out my passion to say, well, where do I have a capacity to, like, influence? And, what we do in Crew in Central Wisconsin is so influential. I mean, just last night at Crew, we heard an incredible story of a person whose life was dramatically changed because somebody walked up to him and didn't talk about politics, but talked to him about the love of Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good place for us to end today, is that part of the reason I love to preach the gospel is because there are people out there right now who have not heard about the love of Jesus. And we have the ability to walk up and do that. And that, to me, seems like a place to leverage influence, relationship, all of these things that maybe is more impactful than the ways that we could, take a deep dive into the political world. So thanks, guys. Our time is up. This was an awesome conversation. Flew by as usual. And so thanks for being on the podcast. Seth, thanks for putting all that time into your talk. It was an amazing talk. And we'll see you next time.
See ya.